Hey everyone! Today we will be going over a historical and philosophical case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which, if true, is the most important event in all of human history. If that single event truly happened, then Christianity is true. God is real. At least one miracle has truly happened, and death itself has been defeated. However, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then Christianity entirely collapses. The Apostle Paul himself admitted this in 1 Corinthians 15, which reads, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile, you are still in your sins." So, the entire Christian faith truly hangs on this one historical event. That means that the question of whether he truly did rise or not should be of utmost importance for anyone debating its validity. Before we begin, I want to make sure my intent is understood clearly. This presentation is not about winning an argument, embarrassing skeptics, or stirring up needless conflict. Scripture actually, explicitly, and repeatedly warns us against that. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A gentle answer turns away wrath." And Romans 12:18 says, "As far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." So, my goal here is not to quarrel. I do not want to mock unbelievers or belittle honest doubts. I want to create a space for honest thinking, careful reasoning, and mutual respect, because it is in no one's interest for me to act with anything but humility. Scripture does also call us to intellectual courage. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 10:3-5, "We demolish arguments and every lofty opinion that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ." This means we are called to both gentleness and boldness. So that is my commitment in this presentation, a peaceful tone with a rigorous mind. My central claim is this: the resurrection hypothesis best explains the core historical data when evaluated by standard criteria of historical reasoning. I want us to not simply assume it is true, but instead compare it to alternative explanations, and then evaluate each explanation using consistent historical criteria. So, here's the challenge. Skeptics often dismiss the resurrection before they even look at the evidence. Why is this? Simply because it's a miracle. They might admit that he did live, teach, and die by crucifixion, but they refuse to even consider that he was raised from the dead because it defies the laws of nature. And because of that, they claim that history cannot affirm it. But notice that this argument assumes several things before a single piece of evidence is even examined. First, consider what scientists do every single day. Physicists confidently work with dark matter, quantum fields, and virtual particles. Things no one has ever directly seen or touched. They accept them not because they've observed them, but because they observe effects that are best explained by their existence. The entity is invisible, but the evidence for it is not. Science is actually quite comfortable operating that way. Now, someone might say, those phenomena are repeatable and measurable, which is totally fair. And that's exactly why the resurrection isn't primarily a science question, it's a history question. And here's the thing about history. Historians routinely affirm one-time, unrepeatable events based on testimony and evidence. We don't require Caesar's assassination to happen again before we believe it occurred. History, by its very nature, deals with singular events, and it has tools for evaluating them. So when someone says, miracles are impossible, therefore the resurrection didn't happen, they haven't done history, they've done philosophy, and then pretended it was history. They've decided the verdict before even examining any evidence. The real question isn't, can miracles happen? Though that is worth asking. The real question is, what does the evidence actually show? And that's exactly what we're going to look at. So, a note on humility and bias. To be completely fair about that point on prior assumptions, every person who approaches the resurrection, whether Christian, skeptic, agnostic, or anything in between, does so with assumptions already in place. Christians, like myself, believe God exists and can act in history. Skeptics often assume the opposite, that the world is a closed system of cause and effect. Historians sometimes adopt methodological naturalism, which limits explanations to natural causes by rule. I want to acknowledge my own bias openly. I am a Christian. I do believe the resurrection happened, but my goal here is not to defend this belief by force. It is to take the best skeptical arguments seriously, to weigh them fairly, and then to ask what the evidence itself supports. I want to ask you to join me in approaching this topic with humility on both sides, skeptical humility, and Christian humility. We all have blind spots. If we're going to have an honest conversation, we have to admit that they are there. So, some people immediately shrug and say, why does it matter? Who cares what a small religious group in the first century believed? But the resurrection claim was not a minor private belief. Within weeks of Jesus' crucifixion, his followers were publicly proclaiming that he had risen from the dead, and within decades, that message had spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. Whatever one ultimately concludes about its truth, the resurrection proclamation had enormous historical consequences. It shaped communities, ethics, and institutions across centuries. That alone does not prove it to be true, but it does mean the question deserves serious historical investigation. This is not an abstract debate. It has real consequences. Once again, if the resurrection is true, then God has entered history and validated the claims of Jesus. If it is not, then Christianity is built on a falsehood. So before we dive into the historical evidence, I want to briefly discuss the concept known as Pascal's wager. The idea, in its simplest form, is that if Christianity is true, the cost of rejecting it is infinite, while the cost of believing it is finite. But I want to be very clear. A wager without evidence is not convincing. If someone told you to believe in God purely on pragmatic grounds with no evidence at all, that would be no different than asking you to believe in any other supposed deity. In that scenario, Pascal's wager would be meaningless. So I am not asking you to wager blindly. What I am asking is that we truly do consider the consequences of our belief after we examine the evidence, because a wager only becomes rational once a claim is at least plausible. We'll revisit this at the end of the presentation. So this is how the whole thing will unfold. First, we are finishing up Section 1 now, which has served as an introduction and framing for the presentation. In Section 2, we'll first establish that God and miracles are at least possible. If we rule them out ahead of time, then the evidence doesn't even matter. Then in Section 3, we'll look at the historical evidence for the resurrection. This is the big one. That being the empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, transformation of the disciples, the burial, and the crucifixion. In Section 4, we'll evaluate the most common naturalistic theories such as hallucinations, cognitive dissonance, the swoon theory, stolen body theory, and others. In Section 5, we'll address apparent contradictions in the gospel accounts. In Section 6, we'll consider what actual scholars, both Christian and skeptical, agree upon. In Section 7, we'll put it all together in a cumulative, nicely neat case. In Section 8, we'll summarize everything and consider the real-world implications. And then in Section 9, I'll make a simple final appeal. So with all that in mind, let's start where many skeptics begin, which is with the claim that miracles are impossible. Before we even look at Jesus, we need to ask if belief in God is reasonable. If it is at least possible that there is a creator who can act in history, because if God exists, then raising Jesus from the dead is at least conceptually possible. If God does not exist, then we don't even need to look at the evidence. So that's where we are going to go next. The case for God's existence. Section 2. The case for God's existence and miracles. Before we dive into the historical evidence for the resurrection, we need to stop and ask a crucial question. Is God even possible? Because if you've already decided in advance that God does not exist, then no matter what evidence you see, you'll dismiss the resurrection as impossible. But if God is at least possible, if it's at least reasonable to consider that there might be a creator, then the resurrection can be evaluated fairly. So in this section, I want to make a cumulative case that belief in God is not only possible, but philosophically reasonable. So first, the arguments for God's existence. The Kalam cosmological argument. Let's start with one of the simplest ones. So this cosmological argument goes like this. First, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Second, the universe began to exist. So third, therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, step one seems obvious. Our experience and philosophical reasoning both support the principle that things which begin to exist require a cause. We don't see cars, houses, or planets just appear from nothing. Step 2, the universe began to exist, is affirmed by both philosophy and modern science. Philosophically, many thinkers argue that an infinite regress of past events is problematic. if the past were actually infinite, then the present moment could never be reached through one event after another. Scientifically, the Big Bang model tells us that space, time, matter, and energy all came into existence at a finite point in the past, which means step 3 follows. The universe has a cause, and since this cause must be outside of space and time, immaterial, and immensely powerful, it sounds a whole lot like what people mean when they say God. Next, we have the contingency argument, made famous by Gottfried Leibniz. It says, everything that exists has an explanation for existence. The universe exists, therefore the universe has an explanation. Now, some things exist necessarily, like abstract numbers or logical truths. They don't depend on anything else. But the universe is not necessary. It could have not existed. That means it must have an external explanation. And what could that explanation be, if not a being beyond space and time? Now, let's move to the evidence of design. Scientists have discovered that the laws of physics are finely tuned for life. For example, the force of gravity, the strength of the electromagnetic force, the ratio of protons to electrons. All of these constants are set at values so precise that if they were even slightly different, life would be impossible. So how is this explained? Chance seems wildly improbable. Necessity doesn't work because the constants could have been otherwise. The best explanation is design. An intelligent creator set the universe up in a way that allows life. Some propose a multiverse to explain this fine-tuning, but even if such a multiverse exists, it would still raise deeper questions about why such a life-permitting system of universes exists at all. Now, these are only a few of the philosophical arguments for God's existence. Philosophers have also proposed others: moral arguments, arguments from consciousness, arguments from reason, and arguments from religious experiences, but exploring each of these in depth would take us far beyond the scope of this presentation. My goal here is not to primarily focus on why God is real, but instead simply to show that belief in God is not intellectually unreasonable, and that the existence of a creator is a serious philosophical possibility. So, now we're going to go over the skeptic pushbacks to those. Of course, there are also many objections that skeptics raise against belief in God, and against the possibility of miracles generally. These range from philosophical arguments about the problem of evil, to scientific questions about cosmology and evolution, to broader critiques of religion as a social or psychological phenomenon. Addressing every objection would take far more time than we have here. Instead, I want to focus on what many philosophers consider the most important challenge to miracles: the argument made famous by the philosopher David Hume. So, David Hume argues that miracles are always the least likely explanation because they violate the laws of nature. But notice, this is not primarily a historical objection. It is a philosophical one about how we should evaluate reports of miracles. If we rule out miracles in advance, then no amount of historical evidence could ever lead us to conclude that one occurred. This is circular reasoning. History can't decide between natural and supernatural before looking at the evidence. It must weigh what best explains the facts. Now, the strongest version of Hume's objection actually goes deeper than simply miracles don't happen. David Hume's point was that our experience of the world consistently follows natural laws. Because these laws are so uniform, he argued, any testimony about a miracle is always less probable than the possibility that the testimony is mistaken. In addition, many historians today operate under what's called methodological naturalism, which is the principle that historical explanations must rely on only natural causes, even if a supernatural cause might be true. It's not meant as bias, but instead a rule of the discipline. My goal is not to misrepresent that view, unless I am missing something. It's a logical truth that if your method only allows natural explanations, then of course a resurrection will never be the best explanation, no matter the evidence. But that is precisely why this discussion must step outside strict methodology. If the event in question is supernatural by nature, then refusing in advance to consider supernatural explanations will guarantee we never reach the truth. So what I'm asking for here is not a suspension of reason, but a suspension of methodological limits long enough to evaluate the evidence fairly. So, reviewing everything so far, The universe appears to have a beginning and therefore requires an explanation beyond itself. The existence of contingent reality points toward a necessary foundation of existence, and the fine-tuning of the laws of physics suggests that the universe is not the product of blind chance alone. None of these arguments proves God beyond doubt, but together they show that belief in a creator is philosophically reasonable. If God does not exist, then miracles are not impossible. But if God does exist, then miracles are not violations of nature, they are simply actions of the author of nature. This means the resurrection of Jesus cannot be dismissed in advance. It must be evaluated on historical grounds. So, now that we've established that miracles are possible, let's turn to the heart of the matter, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. We'll look at 5 key facts: the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the transformation of the disciples, the burial of Jesus, and his crucifixion. Section 3. The core evidence for the resurrection. One clarification before we continue. I'm organizing this section by evidential weight, not by timeline. In other words, we're starting with what historians are least confident about, working toward what historians most commonly agree upon. So, we will be starting with the empty tomb. According to the Gospels, on the 3rd day, several women went to the tomb and found it empty. That claim is central to Christianity, but it's also one of the more debated pieces of the historical case. So rather than assume it's true, we need to weigh the evidence carefully. All 4 Gospels record that the empty tomb was found by women on the 1st day of the week. Mark 16, 1-8 shows Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome going to the tomb at dawn. They find the stone rolled away, and a young man in white tells them Jesus has risen. Matthew 28, 1-10 shows Mary Magdalene and the other Mary visiting. An angel appears, the guards tremble, and the women are told Jesus has risen. Luke 24, 1-12 shows several women, including Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, finding the tomb empty. 2 men in dazzling clothes announce the resurrection. And lastly, John 20, 1-18 shows Mary Magdalene going alone. She sees the stone removed and runs to tell Peter and John. They come, see the empty tomb, and return. Later, Mary encounters Jesus himself. Though the details differ, all 4 do agree the tomb was empty and women were the first witnesses. The fact that they all display women as the first witnesses is a critical point. In 1st century Jewish culture, women's testimony was not highly regarded. Josephus wrote that women were not reliable witnesses in court. In Roman culture, too, female testimony was often dismissed as less credible. If the early Christians were inventing a story, the last thing they would have done is make the women the primary witnesses of the empty tomb. If they wanted their story to be persuasive, they would have chosen Peter or John or any of the other male disciples. The fact that women are consistently presented as the first discoverers is at least surprising, if this were pure invention. And many historians think it points towards an early memory that the tradition preserved, even if it was culturally awkward. Another point strongly in favor of the empty tomb is that the resurrection was first proclaimed in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been executed and buried. So think about that. If Jesus' body were still in the tomb, or if his location were known, opponents, enemies of this, could have easily refuted the message by producing the corpse. Yet Christianity spread rapidly in Jerusalem despite fierce opposition. The silence of the authorities is at least suggestive. It isn't decisive by itself, but it fits better with an early controversy over an empty tomb than with a publicly known occupied grave. We don't have a record of Jerusalem leaders publicly producing a body to shut the movement down, even though that would have been the simplest refutation if a known tomb still contained Jesus' remains. Matthew 28, 11-15 reports a counter-explanation circulating among the opponents, that the disciples stole the body. Now, even if someone questions Matthew's details, the type of counterclaim is significant. The body was taken only makes sense if the tomb is thought to be empty. In other words, the earliest debate, as reflected in later sources, seems to assume an absence that needs explaining, not a corpse that can be displayed. A more sophisticated objection would be that the empty tomb does not have clear multiple attestations outside of the Gospels. Paul doesn't narrate it, and Acts emphasizes appearances. This does deserve serious consideration, but the burial tradition is early. The resurrection proclamation begins in Jerusalem, and the later reports of early polemic fit more naturally with an empty tomb claim than with a known occupied grave. These factors don't settle the question by themselves, but they do push the empty tomb tradition closer to the earliest layer of Christian memory, which contradicts what late legend theories often suggest. Paul's summary in 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't explicitly mention the empty tomb, but it does include, he was buried, he was raised on the third day. On its own, that doesn't prove an empty tomb. However, it does show that burial and resurrection were linked very early in Christian proclamation, and that makes it historically plausible that an empty tomb claim could arise very early, even if it isn't stated explicitly in the creed. The details of the empty tomb match what we know of first-century burial practices. Rolling stones were used to seal wealthy tombs, women preparing spices for burial fits Jewish custom, and visiting the tomb early on the third day fits the Jewish mourning cycle. Nothing in the story screams legendary embellishment. In fact, it reads naturally against the cultural backdrop. So, what do scholars say? N.T. Wright argues that the empty tomb and the appearances together best explain the rise of early Christianity. William Lane Craig, of course, defends the empty tomb as historically likely. Gary Habermas's work suggests a substantial portion of scholars affirm the empty tomb, though estimates vary depending on how studies are counted and categorized. And then skeptical scholar Bart Ehrman notes that some scholars argue for the empty tomb and some against. It is debated and not as widely accepted as the crucifixion. So the careful conclusion is this. The empty tomb is not a universal, minimal fact, but it remains a serious, historically argued claim, and it's part of the cumulative case many scholars think best fits the data. So why does the empty tomb matter? Because if the tomb was still occupied and publicly identifiable, the message would have been far easier to falsify in Jerusalem. And if the tomb was empty because of natural causes such as theft, mistake, or reburial, then we still have to ask why the earliest Christians so confidently proclaimed resurrection, rather than simply saying the body is gone. The empty tomb by itself doesn't prove the resurrection, but it narrows the options. If the tomb was empty, then something extraordinary happened. The question becomes, what best explains it? So where does this leave us? The empty tomb is historically argued and supported by several converging considerations, but it's also debated, and it shouldn't be treated as certain in the same way the crucifixion is. That's why the next step matters even more. Appearances. Did multiple people and groups genuinely come to believe they encountered the risen Jesus? And how early does that testimony go? That's where we're going next. The post-mortem appearances. We've examined the empty tomb claim. Now we ask the next question. Did anyone actually see him alive again? The Christian claim was never simply that the tomb was empty. The heart of the message was actually that they had seen the Lord. The earliest Christians didn't merely believe in a spiritual continuation or that Jesus lived on in memory. They proclaimed that he appeared to them literally and physically alive again. So let's carefully examine the evidence for these supposed post-mortem appearances. First, we have the most important piece of evidence, which comes from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written around AD 55. In chapter 15, Paul cites a tradition he himself had received, likely when he first visited Jerusalem a few years after his conversion. Many scholars date this tradition to within a few years of Jesus' death. Here's what it says in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. This is astonishing. Within a few years of Jesus' crucifixion, Christians were already proclaiming multiple appearances, to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 people at once, to James, to all the apostles, and to Paul himself. And notice Paul's confidence. He mentions that most of the 500 are still living. Now, his letter was not a public open invitation, as it went to the specific church in Corinth. But the point stands. Paul is writing within a generation of the events, naming a large group of people he considers verifiable witnesses. That's not the move of someone who is fabricating a story because it could easily be tested. So next we have the gospel accounts. Matthew 28, Luke 24, John 20 through 21, and Acts 1 all expand on this tradition with multiple appearance stories. These accounts describe encounters with individuals and groups in different locations. Each gospel highlights different encounters, but the diversity itself is significant. These aren't carbon copies of one another. They are independent traditions converging on the same core. Jesus appeared alive to the individuals and groups, indoors and outdoors, in Jerusalem and Galilee, to men and women, and friends and skeptics. Let's highlight a few of those. So we have Peter, or Cephas, who is the first named witness in the early creed. Peter went from denying Jesus 3 times to boldly preaching in Jerusalem weeks later. His transformation is tied directly to his encounter with the risen Jesus. Next we have James, the brother of Jesus. This is one of the most fascinating. The Gospels suggest that Jesus' family, including James, did not believe in him during his ministry, per Mark 3:21 and John 7:5. Yet, James later became the leader of the Jerusalem church and was eventually martyred for his faith. What explains this dramatic change? Paul tells us, the risen Jesus appeared to James. Lastly, we have Paul himself, which is the most striking case. Paul was not just a skeptic, he was an enemy. He persecuted Christians, approved of their murder, and sought to destroy the movement. And yet, he claims that the risen Jesus appeared to him on the road to Damascus, and this encounter transformed him from persecutor to apostle, the very type of person he had killed, who was Stephen. It's hard to imagine a stronger historical anchor than multiple individuals, including former skeptics and enemies, claiming to have encountered Jesus alive. Even more striking are the group appearances. The creed mentions the 12 and more than 500 at once. Group appearance reports are historically noteworthy because hallucinations are typically individual experiences, which makes the group claim harder to explain on that model. The Gospels also record group encounters. The disciples in the locked room in John 20, the disciples on the mountain in Galilee in Matthew 28, and the breakfast by the sea in John 21. This variety of settings and group context strengthens the case. This doesn't automatically prove the resurrection, but it does raise the bar for purely individual vision explanations. Later traditions describe these encounters in vivid ways, speaking with Jesus, sharing meals, and even touching him. Whether one interprets these descriptions literally or symbolically, the key historical point is that early Christians believed they had encountered the risen Jesus in ways they experienced as real and convincing. So what do historians say about the appearances? Gerhard Ludemann, an atheistic scholar, claims, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. E.P. Sanders states that Jesus' followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. And N.T. Wright argues that the disciples did not invent that empty tomb or the appearances, and that nothing in first century Judaism prepared anyone to expect what happened. So notice, even skeptical scholars affirm that the disciples really believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. The debate is not whether they believed it, but what explains their belief. So where does this leave us? We have multiple independent sources recording appearances. The early creed in 1 Corinthians confirms the tradition within a few years. Named witnesses like Peter, James, and Paul are included. Group encounters are reported, not just individual experiences. And even skeptical scholars agree the disciples really believed they saw Jesus alive. This is historical bedrock. You may not believe the resurrection, but it is difficult to deny that the disciples were convinced they had encountered the risen Jesus. So far, we've seen two things. Jesus' tomb was reported empty, and many of his followers believed they had encountered him alive afterward. That raises another historical question. How did a frightened and defeated group of disciples become bold public witnesses of the resurrection? That brings us to the next piece of evidence, the transformation of the disciples. One of the most striking historical features of early Christianity is the transformation of Jesus' followers. Before the crucifixion, the disciples were fearful, confused, and in hiding. After the crucifixion, they were devastated and their hopes had been shattered. Yet within weeks, these same men and women were boldly proclaiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. In Jerusalem, the very city where he had been executed. They endured imprisonment, persecution, and death for this message. Something happened that transformed them. The question is, what? Now let's remember what the Gospels tell us about the disciples during Jesus' ministry, and especially at the end. Peter was the boldest of the disciples, swore he would never abandon Jesus, but denied him 3 times when confronted by a servant girl. And as for the others, we read in Matthew 26:56 that when Jesus was arrested in Gethsemane, all the disciples deserted him and fled. After the crucifixion, John 20:19 says that they were hiding behind locked doors for fear of the Jewish leaders. In other words, they were crushed, their Messiah was dead, and their movement seemed over. They had no expectation that a single individual would rise from the dead in the middle of history. Now, fast forward a few weeks, in Acts 2:32, we find Peter, who once denied Jesus, now boldly preaching in Jerusalem that God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. In Acts 5:29-30, we have the disciples who had fled in fear, now standing before the Sanhedrin, the very council that condemned Jesus. And they say, "We must obey God rather than men. The God of our fathers raised Jesus from the dead." Instead of running, they rejoice when beaten, because they are counted worthy of suffering for his name. What explains this turnaround? The disciples didn't just preach the resurrection, they were willing to suffer and die for it. Early Christian tradition reports that several apostles suffered martyrdom, including Peter in Rome, Andrew in Greece, and Thomas in India, though historians do debate the historical certainty of some of these later accounts. What is historically secure is that persecution began very early on. Acts records the execution of James, the son of Zebedee, and the Jewish historian Josephus records the execution of James, the brother of Jesus. Now, historians point out that not every detail of later martyrdom traditions can be verified, but what is certain is this. The earliest disciples faced real persecution, imprisonment, and death, and they did so proclaiming the resurrection. People today may die for something they sincerely believe but didn't personally witness. That tells us about their conviction, not about whether the event actually occurred. The disciples were different. They were claiming to be eyewitnesses of the very events in question. Their willingness to suffer doesn't just show sincerity, it shows they believed they had actually seen something. The transformation of the disciples is even more striking in light of their Jewish context. The disciples were Jews. Their entire worldview was shaped by Jewish law and expectation. For them, a crucified Messiah was a contradiction. Deuteronomy 21:23 says, "Cursed is anyone who is hung on a pole." So if anything, Jesus' death should have ended their movement. The logical conclusion was, we were wrong. Yet instead, they proclaimed that Jesus had risen and that his crucifixion was part of God's plan. This represents a radical reinterpretation of their expectations, a shift that requires a powerful catalyst. What do historians say? Gerard Ludemann states it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Even skeptical scholars acknowledge that the earliest disciples sincerely believed that they had encountered the risen Jesus. The debate is not whether they believed it, but what explains their belief. The disciples' transformation also had ripple effects. Within weeks, thousands of Jews in Jerusalem believed. Acts 2:41 says 3,000 were added in a single day. Within decades, Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, and within a few centuries, Christianity spread throughout the Roman world. What fueled this? Not wealth, not power, not violence. It was the conviction that Jesus had literally risen. So, the transformation of the disciples is historically striking. Something happened that convinced them Jesus was alive again. But before we draw conclusions, 2 foundational questions remain. First, was Jesus truly buried? And second, how certain are we that he actually died on the cross? These 2 facts form the foundation of the entire discussion. If they are historically secure, then the resurrection debate becomes much sharper. So let's examine the burial of Jesus. After Jesus' execution, the next crucial question is, what happened to his body? The Gospels tell us that Jesus was taken down from the cross and placed in a rock-hewn tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. But is that historically credible? Or was his body discarded or placed in a common grave, as sometimes happened with other crucifixion victims? The burial of Jesus is debated more than the crucifixion, but the evidence is stronger than many realize. Establishing the burial is important because it connects directly to the empty tomb tradition. Let's start with some historical background. Crucifixion victims were often denied honorable burial. Romans sometimes left bodies exposed or disposed of them in common graves, though local conditions and permissions could create exceptions. But here's the key. The Jewish context of Jerusalem made things different. Jewish law, from Deuteronomy 21, 22 through 23, required that a body not be left exposed overnight. It says, if someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day. So Jewish sensitivity about burial was well known in the ancient world, although details are debated. Both Josephus and Philo of Alexandria record that Jews were allowed by Roman governors to bury crucified bodies before sunset, especially during festivals like Passover. So while the Roman custom was shame and neglect, the Jewish custom was burial. And because Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem under a Roman governor sensitive to Jewish unrest, it's plausible that his body was granted burial. Now let's look at the primary sources. All four Gospels record that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. Mark 15, 43 through 46 shows Joseph, a respected member of the Sanhedrin, asking Pilate for Jesus' body. Pilate is surprised Jesus is already dead, confirms it with a centurion, and grants the request. Joseph wraps the body in linen and lays it in a rock-hewn tomb. Matthew 27, 57 through 60 has Matthew adding that Joseph was a rich man and that the tomb was his own. In Luke 23, 50 through 53, Luke emphasizes Joseph was a good and righteous man who had not consented to the council's decision to condemn Jesus. And in John 19, 38 through 42, John adds that Nicodemus, another Sanhedrin member, helped Joseph with burial spices. This unanimous agreement across all four Gospels is significant. Each gives slightly different details, but all name Joseph of Arimathea as the one who buried Jesus. Some skeptics argue the story was invented to give Jesus an honorable burial. But here's the problem. Joseph of Arimathea is an unlikely fictional character. First, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the very council that condemned Jesus. Why would early Christians invent a sympathetic figure from among their enemies? Second, naming a specific prominent figure like Joseph of Arimathea was risky and suggests the tradition was rooted in remembered events rather than anonymous storytelling. And third, the inclusion of Joseph's name suggests the authors were appealing to a known figure, not making up a faceless benefactor. The story portrays a member of the council that condemned Jesus as the one who provides his burial. That is historically awkward for the early Christian movement and therefore unlikely to be invented. What do we see beyond the Gospels? As mentioned earlier, Josephus and Philo record that Jews were often granted exceptions to bury crucified victims. That matches the Gospel description. Archaeology also supports this. In 1968, the remains of a crucified man named Yehohanan were discovered in Jerusalem. He had been buried in a family tomb with the nail still in his heel bone. This shows that in at least some cases, crucified individuals in Jerusalem were given proper burial. This matters because if Jesus was buried, his tomb could be identified. If his tomb was identified, then the claim that it was empty a few days later has real historical weight. And without burial, the resurrection claim floats without anchor. With burial, the stage is set for the empty tomb tradition. The burial does not prove the resurrection, but it establishes something crucial. Jesus' body was placed in a known location, a specific tomb in Jerusalem. That makes the later resurrection claim historically meaningful. But before drawing conclusions, we must address the most fundamental question of all. Did Jesus actually die on the cross? If he did not truly die, then the entire resurrection claim collapses. So our final historical question is the crucifixion itself. The most foundational question we need to establish is whether Jesus of Nazareth truly died by crucifixion. Because if Jesus did not truly die, the resurrection claim is invalid before we even begin. This is one of the best attested events in the life of Jesus and one of the least disputed facts among historians studying the New Testament. Virtually every scholar, Christian, atheist, agnostic, Jewish, agrees that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion in the first century. Even the harshest critics of Christianity don't deny this point. So let's take a closer look at why the evidence for the crucifixion is so overwhelming. First, some background. Crucifixion was Rome's most brutal form of execution. It was not only meant to kill, but to humiliate and to terrorize. Victims were stripped naked, flogged with whips embedded with bone or metal, and often forced to carry the crossbeam through the streets. They were nailed or tied to the wood, lifted up for the public to see, and left to die slowly over hours or even days. Roman historian Cicero called it the most cruel and disgusting penalty. Josephus, a Jewish historian writing there in the 1st century, described crucifixion as the most wretched of deaths. This was the fate Jesus faced under Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Crucifixion was a public form of execution carried out by Roman authorities because it involved official action and public visibility. It is extremely unlikely that the event itself could have been invented by later followers. The crucifixion is recorded in all 4 Gospels: Matthew 27, Mark 15, Luke 23, and John 19. Each account gives slightly different details, but they all agree on the central point: Jesus was executed by crucifixion under Pilate. The Apostle Paul, writing within 20 to 25 years of the event, repeatedly refers to Jesus' crucifixion. In 1 Corinthians 2:2, he says, "I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." In Galatians 3:1, he writes that Jesus was publicly portrayed as crucified. So from the earliest Christian writings, crucifixion is front and center. This wasn't a later invention. It was part of the Christian proclamation from the very beginning. But here's what's even more significant. Non-Christian, even hostile sources confirm that Jesus was indeed crucified. Tacitus, a Roman historian writing around AD 116, described the execution of Jesus in his Annals, saying, "Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate." Tacitus was no friend of Christianity. He called it a most mischievous superstition. Yet he confirms that Jesus was crucified under Pilate. Josephus, a Jewish historian writing around AD 93, also mentions Jesus' crucifixion in Antiquities of the Jews, writing, "Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross." Now, to be fair, parts of Josephus' reference to Jesus were likely altered by later Christian scribes, but the core reference to his crucifixion is widely regarded as authentic. Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirist in the 2nd century, mocked Christians for worshipping a man who is crucified in Palestine. Even ridicule confirms the basic fact that he was crucified. The Talmud, a collection of Jewish writings, refers to Jesus being hanged, a term often used for crucifixion in that period. So across Roman, Jewish, and Greek sources, many of them hostile to Christianity, we find consistent confirmation that Jesus was indeed executed by crucifixion. Because of this, virtually every historian affirms the crucifixion as historical fact. John Dominic Crossan, a liberal scholar with the Jesus Seminar, writes that Jesus was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. Gerhard Ludemann, an atheist New Testament scholar, states Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. This kind of consensus is rare in ancient history, but when it comes to Jesus' crucifixion, skeptics and believers agree. It happened. So the crucifixion of Jesus is historically secure. He was executed by Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate. Combined with the burial tradition, the empty tomb claims, the reported appearances, and the transformation of his followers, we now have the central historical facts on the table. The question is no longer simply whether these claims were made, but what best explains them. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, then some alternative explanation must account for the evidence. That brings us to the next stage of the investigation, the naturalistic explanations. Section 4, the naturalistic theories. Historians evaluate competing explanations using several criteria, including explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, and the absence of ad hoc assumptions. In simple terms, the best explanation is the one that accounts for the most evidence with the fewest difficulties. So far, we've looked at the 5 core facts. Jesus was crucified, he was buried, his tomb was found empty, many people claimed to see him alive, and his disciples were radically transformed. Now we come to the critical question. If Jesus did not actually rise from the dead, then how do we explain all of this evidence? Over the centuries, skeptics have proposed a variety of naturalistic theories, which are explanations that do not involve God or miracles. These theories attempt to account for the evidence through psychological, social, or historical explanations without appealing to miracles. Historians often compare explanations using a method called inference to the best explanation, asking which theory best accounts for the total set of facts with the fewest difficulties. In this section, we're going to take them seriously. We'll examine the most common theories, which are the hallucination theory, the cognitive dissonance theory, the swoon theory, and the legend theory, and we'll briefly go over these other minor theories: the stolen body theory, the grave relocation theory, the wrong tomb theory, and the twin theory. Each of these explanations has been proposed at one time or another, and while each one does explain some aspect of the evidence, we'll see that none of them explains all of it. First, we have the hallucination theory, which suggests that post-mortem appearances of Jesus were not real encounters, but hallucinations. The disciples, grieving and traumatized, experienced visions of Jesus. This is attractive because hallucinations do happen, especially among grieving people, and, of course, it avoids requiring a miracle. The problems with this theory are that these are group appearances. Hallucinations are normally private experiences rather than shared events, yet Paul reports that Jesus appeared to groups, including more than 500 people at once. Hallucinations cannot account for collective encounters. Also, the diversity of the settings. The appearances were reported by men and women, indoors and outdoors, in Jerusalem and Galilee, to friends and to skeptics. Hallucinations do not normally occur in such varied contexts. Even skeptics converted. James and Paul were not grieving followers. James was skeptical, and Paul was an enemy. They had no psychological motivation to hallucinate Jesus alive. And finally, the empty tomb. Hallucinations might explain appearances, but they don't explain the empty tomb. Next, we have the cognitive dissonance theory. This theory suggests that after Jesus' death, his disciples experienced cognitive dissonance, which is defined as a state of mental discomfort that occurs when a person holds beliefs or opinions that are inconsistent or that conflict with an aspect of their behavior. They believed he was the Messiah, but his crucifixion shattered that belief. To resolve the tension, they convinced themselves he had risen. This is obviously attractive because cognitive dissonance is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, and it explains the persistence of belief after Jesus' death. It avoids requiring a miracle. But the problems are that it does not account for the Jewish context. Jewish expectation anticipated a victorious Messiah, not a crucified one. To claim that a crucified Messiah had risen went against normal Jewish categories. It did not fit them. Also, the resurrection belief. Jews did believe in resurrection, but only as a general event at the end of history, never for one person in the middle of history. Cognitive dissonance would have produced a belief that Jesus was exalted spiritually, not bodily risen. The empty tomb. Dissonance might explain belief, but not the physical evidence of the empty tomb. And then the conversion of the skeptics, Paul and James. They were not caught in dissonance. Paul opposed Christianity. James was skeptical. Yet both converted because of appearances. Some scholars propose an apocalyptic expectation model. First-century Jews lived in a world charged with prophetic hopes, dreams, and anticipations of divine intervention. In such an atmosphere, internal spiritual experiences could be interpreted as eschatological signs or signs of the end times. The disciples may have experienced a genuine sense of Jesus' continued presence and recast it into resurrection language. The challenge for this view is that Jewish apocalyptic expectation anticipated a general resurrection at the end of time, as we've said, not the resurrection of one crucified Messiah in the middle of history. If anything, Jesus' death would have extinguished messianic hopes, not inspired new theological categories overnight. Then, the swoon theory. This is the idea that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He fainted, was taken down alive, revived in the tomb, and appeared to his disciples who mistook him for resurrected. So this is really only attractive simply because it avoids the miracle. The problems with it are that the Romans were experts at execution. Crucifixion was designed to kill, not wound. Jesus had been scourged, nailed, hung for hours, and pierced with a spear. Survival is virtually impossible with those. The medical reality is that even if he survived, he would have been in critical condition. bloody, broken, dehydrated, he would not have inspired disciples to proclaim him as the conqueror of death. At best, he would have needed intensive care. Burial practices. Joseph and Nicodemus wrapped his body with burial spices and linen. They believed he was dead. And then the psychological impact. A half-dead Jesus would not have been proclaimed Lord of life. The disciples might have pitied him, but they would not have worshipped him. So this theory was popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, but is rejected by virtually all modern scholars. And then next we have the legend theory. Some argue that the resurrection stories are legends. Jesus may have inspired his followers, and over decades, stories grew until he was said to have risen. This is attractive because it explains the contradictions in the accounts. But the problems are the dating. The 1 Corinthians 15 creed dates to within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion. That's way too early for legend to develop. The eyewitnesses. Paul points to living eyewitnesses who could confirm or deny. Legendary stories rarely invite verification. The Jewish context. Legends don't usually invent categories foreign to their culture. The resurrection of a single individual in the middle of history was outside normal Jewish expectations. And then the explosion of Christianity. Legends don't usually spark movements in the presence of hostile eyewitnesses. Yet Christianity exploded in Jerusalem. Most historians agree the legend theory cannot explain the early creed, the eyewitness claims, and the rise of the church. Sometimes skeptics say, but don't other religions claim miracles too? Why treat Christianity any differently? The difference is that Christianity's central miracle claim is uniquely historical and falsifiable. The resurrection was preached in a specific city within weeks of the event, where opponents could have challenged the claim directly. By contrast, many miracle claims in other traditions are either spiritual visions, legendary growth over centuries, or unfalsifiable events. The resurrection stands apart in its grounding in testable history. Another objection is the exaltation-only theory, which suggests that the earliest Christians didn't believe Jesus' body rose, but merely that his soul or spirit was exalted to God, similar to Elijah or Enoch. Later storytellers may have transformed this spiritual experience into physical resurrection narratives. The difficulty with this theory is linguistic and chronological. The word anastasis, which literally means resurrection, in Jewish usage always refers to bodily resurrection, never to a purely spiritual continuation. And the earliest Christian creed, which is dated within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion, uses exactly that term, anastasis. There is no developmental time for a shift from spiritual exaltation to bodily resurrection. So here are some other explanations for the empty tomb. Several other proposals also attempt to explain the empty tomb without a resurrection. First, we have the stolen body theory. One of the earliest responses to Christianity was that the disciples stole Jesus' body. Matthew 28:11-15 records this accusation circulating among the opponents. And while this does obviously explain the empty tomb without requiring a miracle, the disciples had no expectation of resurrection and were fearful after the crucifixion. It is psychologically difficult to explain why they would invent a message that brought persecution and suffering. People may die for beliefs that are mistaken, but it is far less common for people to suffer for something that they know they fabricated. Next is the relocation theory. Some suggest the body was moved by authorities, a gardener, or someone else. There's simply no ancient source recording such a relocation. More importantly, if authorities had moved the body, they could have produced it when the disciples began preaching the resurrection in Jerusalem. So that does not make sense. Then we have the wrong tomb theory, which is the suggestion that the women went to the wrong tomb. The problem here is that the tomb belonged to Joseph of Arimathea, and its location was known. The women had seen the burial and returned intentionally. If the wrong tomb had been identified, opponents could easily have pointed to the current location. Finally, we have the twin theory. A few writers have proposed that Jesus had an unknown twin who impersonated him after the crucifixion. This theory simply has no historical support and is generally dismissed by scholars. So, let's summarize the naturalistic theories we covered. Hallucinations explain appearances, but not the empty tomb or group encounters. Cognitive dissonance explains belief persistence, but not resurrection belief in Jewish categories, nor conversions of skeptics. The swoon theory fails both medically and psychologically. The stolen body theory fails on motive and martyrdom. The grave relocation theory fails on evidence and authority silence. The wrong tomb theory fails on eyewitness memory and geography. The twin theory fails on recognition and empty tomb. And the legend theory fails on dating and Jewish context. So, none of these theories are logically impossible. The question is whether any of them adequately explains the full set of historical evidence, and none of them do. There is one additional objection worth addressing. Many historians argue that even if the resurrection did occur, it really happened. History as a discipline cannot affirm it. History is limited to natural causes because natural causes are the only ones that can be studied and repeated. This is not hostility toward religion, it's a methodological boundary. But this boundary also means that even overwhelming evidence for a supernatural event must be reinterpreted as something else. I am examining whether the historical data may point beyond natural explanations, not to escape scrutiny, but because the event itself, if real, is supernatural by definition. To reject it purely on methodological grounds would be to let the method control the conclusion before the evidence is examined. So where does this leave us? If you reject the resurrection, you must choose one of these naturalistic theories. But as we've seen, each one falls short. None explains all the evidence. The crucifixion, the burial, the empty tomb, the appearances, and the transformation of the disciples. The resurrection, by contrast, explains all of them together. The question is not whether an explanation is possible, but which explanation best accounts for the total set of historical facts. But before we conclude, we need to address another issue: the discrepancies in the gospel accounts. Some skeptics argue the inconsistencies undermine the whole story, so let's turn there next. Section 5. The discrepancies in the gospel accounts. One of the most common objections raised against the resurrection is this: the gospel accounts don't line up perfectly. Skeptics point out that there are differences, even contradictions, between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For example, how many women went to the tomb? Was there one angel or two? Did Jesus appear in Galilee or Jerusalem first? Who exactly saw him and when? Some argue these differences undermine the reliability of the resurrection accounts altogether. So in this section, I want to look honestly at these discrepancies, ask whether they really disprove the story, and show why, far from being a weakness, these variations actually strengthen the case. Before we get to the differences themselves, some skeptics raise a broader objection that we can't even trust the Gospels because they were written anonymously decades later. However, anonymity was common in ancient biographies. Attribution to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John appears very early in the historical record. More importantly, even anonymous writings can preserve reliable history, as we see in many Greco-Roman sources. The key question is not the name on the cover, but whether the accounts bear marks of eyewitness testimony, early tradition, and multiple attestation. On those grounds, the Gospels hold up strongly. Let's first step back and think about eyewitness testimony in general. When multiple people witness the same event, do they give identical reports? Of course not. Ask 4 people who saw a car accident what happened. One will focus on the color of the car, another on the speed, another on the sound, another on the driver's face. The core facts will match, but the details will vary. In fact, if witnesses give perfectly identical accounts, investigators become suspicious. Why? Because that usually means collusion. Genuine, independent testimony is always a little messy. So when we see differences in the Gospels, that doesn't automatically mean they are false. It means we're dealing with multiple perspectives, not a rehearsed script. Let's look at some of the most frequently cited differences. Who went to the tomb? Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Luke says a group including Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and others. And John says Mary Magdalene alone. Different writers tend to emphasize different individuals. John, for instance, centers the story on Mary Magdalene, but it's worth noting that even within John's account, Mary says, "We don't know where they have put him," in John 22. which at minimum suggests she didn't think of herself as alone. That's one small internal clue that John may be highlighting Mary without meaning to exclude others entirely. That said, I won't pretend this fully resolves the tension. The number of women varies across all 4 accounts, and not every detail can be neatly reconciled. What we can say is that the discrepancy doesn't require us to conclude the accounts are fabricated. Different writers, writing for different audiences, naturally foregrounded different people. The core point every account agrees on is that women went to the tomb early that morning and found it empty. That agreement across sources with no obvious coordination is what carries the historical weight. Next, how many angels or men? Mark says a young man in white. Matthew says 1 angel. Luke says 2 men in dazzling clothes. And John says 2 angels. This is probably the most defensible of the discrepancies. If 2 angels were present, it's entirely natural that one writer focuses on the one who spoke, while another notes the full number. That kind of selective emphasis happens constantly in historical reporting, ancient and modern. This explanation works more cleanly here than in some of the other discrepancies. The accounts aren't claiming different things happened. They're describing the same scene with different levels of detail. That's a meaningful distinction. A genuine contradiction would be something like one account saying the tomb was guarded and another saying it wasn't. A factual clash that can't be explained by perspective. Different detail levels don't rise to that standard. Next, where did Jesus appear first? Matthew says in Galilee, Luke says in Jerusalem, and John says first in Jerusalem, then later in Galilee. This one is admittedly the hardest of the 4, and I want to be honest about that rather than just simply smooth it over. Luke's account specifically has Jesus instruct the disciples to stay in Jerusalem, which creates real tension with Matthew's Galilee appearance. That's not a detail difference, it's a directional difference, and a careful reader will notice that. The most I can honestly say is this. Acts 1:3 tells us the resurrection appearances spanned 40 days, which at least creates space for appearances in multiple occasions. John's account actually includes both. Jerusalem appearances first, then Galilee, which suggests the 2 traditions aren't necessarily pointing to 2 different events, but perhaps different moments in a longer sequence. Does that fully resolve the tension? Probably not to everyone's satisfaction, but the question worth asking is whether this geographic discrepancy touches the central claim at all. Every account agrees the appearances happened, that the disciples encountered Jesus alive after his death. Where exactly those encounters occurred is a secondary detail. Historians regularly reconstruct events from sources that disagree on geography and sequence. The disagreement here is real, but it doesn't go to the heart of what's being claimed. What time of day did they go? Mark says very early, just after sunrise. Matthew says toward dawn. Luke says early in the morning. And John says still dark. This one is fairly minor, and I think even most skeptics would grant it. The accounts all place the discovery in the early morning hours. The variation is essentially between still dark and just after sunrise, which is the kind of difference you'd expect from people recalling the same general window of time. John may be capturing the moment Mary left for the tomb, while the other accounts describe when the women arrived. That's a plausible reading, though I'd hold it loosely. What's worth noting is that this level of variation is completely normal in ancient historical sources, and in modern eyewitness testimonies for that matter. 2 people recalling the same early morning event a decade later will naturally differ on whether it was dark or just getting light. That kind of imprecision doesn't signal fabrication. If anything, a fabricated account would likely have ironed out this sort of minor inconsistency. The point all 4 accounts agree upon is simple. The tomb was found empty early on the first day of the week. That's the claim that matters, and on that, every account is unanimous. So, there's a principle worth drawing out here. Independent testimony, the kind courts and historians actually find compelling, is never perfectly uniform. When 4 witnesses give word-for-word identical accounts, that raises suspicion of coordination, not confidence in the story. What investigators look for is agreement on the central facts alongside natural variation in peripheral details. That's the pattern that suggests people are drawing on their own genuine recollections rather than a shared script. That's largely what we see in the Gospels. The core is consistent across all 4. The tomb was empty, women discovered it. Jesus appeared alive to his followers. The variation lives in the details. How many women, how many angels, the precise time of mourning. That's a meaningful pattern. I want to be careful not to overstate this, though. Divergence proves independence, not accuracy. Four people could independently misremember the same event or independently develop an embellished tradition without coordinating. So this point doesn't settle the question on its own. What it does is remove one common objection, that the differences signal fabrication. And it suggests these accounts weren't manufactured from a single source. The question of whether the core claim is true has to rest on other evidence, which we'll get to. Some skeptics also raise what's known as the argument from silence. For example, Paul never mentions the empty tomb, Mark ends abruptly without describing appearances, Matthew's account of guards at the tomb appears in no other Gospels. These silences might suggest that certain elements were later additions. Arguments from silence are weak, unless the silence occurs where we would reasonably expect a mention. Paul's letters are our earliest Christian documents, but they are occasional letters addressing church problems, not narrative histories of Jesus' life. Mark's abrupt ending in the earliest manuscripts reflects his literary style, not ignorance of resurrection appearances. Silence by itself cannot outweigh positive evidence. The core agreement is important. Despite the differences in details, the Gospels agree on the essentials. Jesus was crucified and buried in a tomb. On the third day, the tomb was found empty. Women were the first to discover it, and Jesus appeared alive afterward to his followers. That's the core. Those are the points that matter historically. The details, how many women, how many angels, the order of appearances, vary, but the central proclamation is consistent. Now, let's fairly consider the skeptical angle here. The first pushback is that contradictions mean unreliability. If the Gospels can't get the details right, why trust them on the resurrection? And as we've gone over, minor discrepancies are normal in historical testimony. Rejecting the whole event because of detailed differences would mean rejecting most of ancient history, and by that standard we could know almost nothing about the past. A further perspective from modern scholarship is that the Gospels, as ancient biographies, often employ literary shaping, compression of events, thematic arrangement, and selective emphasis. These are not attempts to deceive, but they are normal features of ancient historiography. This means we should not read the Gospels like modern journalistic transcripts. Differences in detail may reflect theological emphasis or narrative craftsmanship rather than error. Recognizing this does not eliminate the historical core. It simply reminds us that ancient writers communicated with different conventions than modern reporters. Pushback 2 is that legends produce contradictions. Skeptics say the contradictions show the story was evolving like a legend. But legends typically become more polished and uniform over time, not more diverse. The rawness of the accounts points to independent recollection, not myth-making. And remember, the earliest creed in 1 Corinthians 15, within 3 to 5 years of the crucifixion, already proclaimed burial, resurrection, and appearances. That's too early for legend. Pushback 3 is that the differences can't be harmonized. Some skeptics argue you can't smooth out all the differences. And maybe not perfectly, but that's okay. We don't need perfect harmonization to know something happened. Ancient battles or historical events often have conflicting reports from different sources. Yet historians still reconstruct what happened by comparing those sources. The Gospels are not transcripts. They are ancient biographies, what scholars call bioi, written in different contexts and emphasizing different aspects of the story. That explains the diversity. And this diversity is a strength. Imagine if the resurrection were a fabricated story. Wouldn't the early Christians have made sure the details lined up neatly? Wouldn't they have smoothed over the awkward differences? The fact they didn't suggests authenticity. They reported what was remembered, even if it didn't all fit neatly together. Bart Ehrman admits that while the details differ, the core, that disciples had experiences they believed were appearances of Jesus, is historically undeniable. So why does all this matter for our case? Because skeptics often say the Gospels contradict, therefore they're unreliable, but history doesn't work that way. Minor discrepancies are expected. What matters is the central claim. And on that, the Gospels agree. Jesus' tomb was empty and he appeared alive. So, I know that was a lot of repetition, but it's very important. So let's sum things up again. The Gospel accounts do indeed have variations. These variations are simply exactly what we would expect from independent eyewitness testimony. the core facts remain solid. The discrepancies don't weaken the case, they strengthen it by showing the accounts weren't colluded or manufactured. So that's a big deal, that's important. Now, with that clarified, let's look at what scholars, both Christian and skeptical, agree upon when it comes to the resurrection. Section 6, Scholarly Consensus and Bias. We've walked through the core evidence for the resurrection. Now the question is, what do historians themselves say about this evidence? Is it just believers who accept it, or is there a wider scholarly consensus? The answer is significant. While scholars debate the interpretation of the evidence, whether it points to resurrection or something else, there is broad agreement on many of the historical facts themselves, and this consensus includes atheists, agnostics, and non-Christian historians. One way scholars and apologists have framed this discussion is through what's often called the minimal facts approach, most famously developed by historians Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. The minimal facts approach identifies historical claims that are accepted by a wide range of scholars, including many who are not Christians. These facts are drawn from mainstream historical research and are widely discussed in the academic literature. The minimal facts generally include the following. Jesus died by crucifixion. His disciples believed they experienced appearances of the risen Jesus. Paul, a skeptic and enemy of Christianity, was suddenly converted. James, the brother of Jesus, a skeptic, was converted. And the Christian movement spread rapidly in Jerusalem, the very place where Jesus had been crucified. Some scholars also include the burial by Joseph of Arimathea and the empty tomb, but these are simply debated more, so I didn't include them here. The point is this: you don't have to believe in the resurrection to affirm these facts. They are acknowledged across the scholarly spectrum. These facts therefore form a shared starting point between believers and skeptics, a common historical foundation from which competing explanations can be fairly evaluated. As we've already seen, the crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate is one of the best attested facts of ancient history. John Dominic Crossan writes that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. This near universal agreement makes crucifixion the solid foundation of our case. Next, the Post-Mortem Appearances has widespread consensus. Virtually all scholars agree that the disciples truly did believe they had seen Jesus alive after his death. Gerhard Ludemann, an atheist historian, writes, and we've already quoted this 2 times, but it's a big one. It's important. He says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. And even Bart Ehrman, as we've been saying, one of Christianity's most prominent academic critics, acknowledges that the disciples sincerely believed they had seen Jesus alive after his death. His disagreement is not with the fact of their belief, it's with what caused it. Notice the wording here. So believed, claimed. Skeptics don't necessarily think the resurrection happened, but they do agree the disciples were convinced it did. The sudden conversion of Paul and James also has wide support. Paul himself repeatedly testifies to his encounter with the risen Jesus. His letters are among the earliest Christian writings we have, and they leave no doubt. Paul believed he had seen Jesus alive. Josephus records that Jesus was executed in AD 62 after becoming a prominent leader in the Jerusalem church. Even skeptical scholars struggle to explain these conversions without some dramatic catalyst. And then the explosion of Christianity in Jerusalem. Another widely acknowledged historical reality is that this Christianity movement spread rapidly in Jerusalem after Jesus' death. This is remarkable. If the tomb still held his body, and if the authorities had easy disproof at hand, Christianity should have been dead on arrival. Instead, thousands joined the movement within weeks. Historians across the spectrum do agree something extraordinary sparked this growth. For the burial in an empty tomb, which, of course, does have some consensus, it's just not universal. For the burial, a significant majority of scholars do affirm the burial by Joseph of Arimathea as historical. The specific naming of Joseph and Jewish burial context are what make it plausible. For the empty tomb, many scholars do affirm the tradition, though consensus here is weaker than on the other core facts. The role of women as witnesses, the Jerusalem setting, and multiple attestation make it credible. But some skeptics, like John Dominic Crossan, argue that Jesus was buried in a shallow grave, or maybe eaten by dogs. Others argue that the empty tomb story developed later. Still, many scholars conclude that Jesus was buried and that the tomb was later found empty. At this point, it's worth acknowledging bias directly. Every scholar in this debate, Jewish, Christian, atheist, agnostic, they all bring intellectual commitments shaped by personal experiences, worldview, and academic training. Christians may be inclined to accept miracle claims more readily. Skeptics may be inclined to reject them. Historians may prefer natural explanations out of professional caution. None of these perspectives are perfectly neutral. The real question is not whether bias exists, but whether the explanation offered makes the best sense of the evidence. My goal here is not to claim perfect objectivity. No one has that. But to approach the question with transparency, fairness, and intellectual humility. Why do all these scholars' opinions matter? Because it shows the resurrection case isn't built on blind faith or wishful thinking. Even historians who don't believe in miracles acknowledge the facts. The debate is not whether they happened, but it's how to explain them. The resurrection, uniquely, is the best explanation for all of them. Naturalistic theories attempt to explain some of the facts, but each struggles to account for the full set of evidence together. The resurrection hypothesis provides the single explanation that accounts for all of them. Why did the disciples believe Jesus was alive? Because he was. Why did skeptics like Paul and James convert? Because they truly encountered him. Why did the tomb remain empty? Because Jesus rose. Why did the Christian movement spread rapidly in Jerusalem? Because something undeniable happened there. This is why many scholars acknowledge that the resurrection hypothesis explains the historical data remarkably well, even if they personally remain unconvinced by this supernatural explanation. So, reviewing this section, scholarly consensus strongly affirms Jesus' crucifixion and the disciples' belief that they had encountered the risen Jesus. Many scholars also accept the conversions of Paul and James and the rapid rise of the early Christian movement. A majority of scholars also affirm the burial and empty tomb, although not all. Bias exists, but it cuts both ways. The facts themselves are not in serious dispute. The real debate is the interpretation of these facts. And that brings us to the next step, pulling it all together into a cumulative case. Because while each piece of evidence is strong on its own, it's the way they all fit together that makes the resurrection the one that best explains them all. So, Section 7, the cumulative case wrap-up. We've now walked through the evidence piece by piece. We've looked at alternative explanations for the evidence. We've looked at the objections to the reliability of the Gospels, and we've looked at the scholarly consensus. Now it's time to step back and look at the big picture, because the strength of the resurrection case is not just in the individual pieces, but in how they fit together. So think of this like a courtroom. A lawyer doesn't win a case with one piece of evidence alone. They build a cumulative argument. Fingerprints, eyewitnesses, motive, DNA, each line of evidence reinforces the others. That's exactly what we have with the resurrection. Each fact is significant on its own, but together they create a powerful, unified case. Let's trace how the evidence interlocks. First, we have the crucifixion, which secures the starting point. No historian disputes it. Then the burial, which anchors the story in a specific tomb, making later claims testable. Then the empty tomb, which prevents hallucination or dissonance theories from standing alone. Then the post-mortem appearances, which provide personal, experiential testimony from multiple sources. Then the transformation of the disciples, which shows they were convinced beyond fear or doubt. We also have the conversion of Paul and James, adding to the mix a skeptic and enemy, both turning to witnesses. And finally, the rapid growth of the Christian movement, which ultimately demonstrates the lasting, world-changing impact. Together, these create what historians call converging lines of evidence. One strand can be questioned, but altogether they are hard to dismiss. Now let's revisit the naturalistic theories in light of this cumulative picture. Hallucinations might explain appearances, but not the empty tomb or the conversion of skeptics. Cognitive dissonance might explain persistence of belief, but not a crucified Messiah in Jewish categories, nor Paul's conversion. The swoon theory might explain appearances, but not the disciples' conviction, and certainly not the transformation of skeptics. The stolen body theory might explain the empty tomb, but not the post-mortem appearances, nor the willingness to die. The wrong tomb theory might explain confusion, but not appearances or conversions. And the legend theory might explain inconsistencies, but not the early creed within a few years of the crucifixion, nor the rapid rise of faith in Jerusalem. Each theory can explain a fragment. None explain the whole. Only the resurrection tie it all together. The most modest skeptical conclusion is this. The The disciples had powerful experiences which convinced them Jesus was alive, but we cannot know what caused those experiences. This is an honest and respectable position. It acknowledges the data. Appearances transform lives, rapid expansion, without accepting a supernatural explanation, but it also leaves the central question unanswered. If the disciples were convinced Jesus was alive, what best accounts for that conviction? Minimizing the conclusion does not explain the cause of those experiences. Historical humility must not become historical evasion. What makes the resurrection stand out is its explanatory power. It explains the disciples' transformation from fear to boldness. It explains the empty tomb, why nobody, friend or foe, could produce a body. It explains the appearances to individuals and groups, including friends, enemies, and skeptics. It explains the skeptics' conversion Paul and James weren't predisposed to believe. And it explains the rise of Christianity, a global movement born in the shadow of an executed Messiah. The resurrection is not merely a possible explanation. It is the explanation that best accounts for the full set of historical facts. Sometimes skeptics say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but what we actually need is simply sufficient evidence, the same way we weigh any historical claim. And here we don't just have one piece of evidence. We have multiple converging lines, which when taken together become extraordinary evidence. It's worth remembering that all historical reasoning is probabilistic. Historians don't give 100% mathematical proof to anything in antiquity. We weigh which explanation best accounts for the data. When skeptics say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, what they often mean is that resurrection requires absolute proof. But that's not how history works. The right standard is which explanation makes the most sense of the evidence we have. And by that standard, resurrection wins. Imagine you're putting together a puzzle. At first, you try different pieces. Some fit part of the picture but leave gaps. Others force you to bend the cardboard, and the image doesn't align. But then you try the right piece and everything clicks. That's the resurrection. Naturalistic theories try to jam the pieces into place, but they leave gaps. The resurrection brings the picture into focus. Another way to see this is by asking what caused the explosion. Christianity went from a tiny group of disheartened Jews to a global movement within decades. Something had to light that fuse. Hallucinations alone rarely spark enduring religious movements. Stolen corpses don't produce martyrs, and legends don't arise in the presence of hostile eyewitnesses. But resurrection does. Historians use certain criteria to evaluate explanations. Explanatory scope. Does it explain all the facts? Explanatory power. Does it make sense of the data? Plausibility. Does it align with what we know of the context? Not being ad hoc. Does it avoid unnecessary assumptions? And illumination. Does it open up further understanding? By these criteria, the resurrection provides a stronger explanation of the evidence than the alternatives. For the scope, it accounts for crucifixion, burial, empty tomb, appearances, conversions, and growth. For power, it makes sense of the disciples' radical shift. For plausibility, it fits Jewish resurrection categories, though in a shocking way. For ad hoc, it doesn't require inventing speculative twins, wrong tombs, or group hallucinations. And for illumination, it explains not only history, but why billions today still believe. At this point, skeptics may say, okay, the resurrection explains the data, but it can't be true because miracles are impossible. But notice what's happening. That is not a historical objection, it's a philosophical one. It's not, the evidence doesn't support it, it's, I refuse to allow it. And that's bias, not history. If we approach the evidence with an open mind, allowing at least the possibility of God, then the resurrection is the best explanation. Let's look at what these scholars say. Pinchas Lapid, an Orthodox Jewish New Testament scholar, even argued that the resurrection was historically plausible, though he did not accept Christian theology. He states, I accept the resurrection of Jesus not as an invention of the community of disciples, but as an historical event. N.T. Wright has argued that the historical rise of the early Christian movement is best explained by the resurrection itself, and Cambridge scholar C.F.D. Mule argued that the rise of early Christianity tears a hole in history, the shape and size of the resurrection, and asked what the secular historian proposes to fill it with. Notice, some scholars are believers, some are not. All recognize the resurrection uniquely explains all the facts. One fact alone might not persuade, but all the facts together carry weight. Would the disciples have endured persecution and suffering for something they knew to be false? Would Paul, Christianity's fiercest enemy, have converted for a dream? Would thousands in Jerusalem have followed if the body were still in the tomb? Would James, who mocked his brother, have become the leader of the church if nothing happened? One by one, these questions build, and the weight presses toward resurrection. So let's summarize this cumulative case. The resurrection explains all the facts. Naturalistic theories explain only fragments. The scholarly consensus affirms the core data, and philosophical objections lose much of their force once we allow that miracles are at least possible. At the end of the day, the resurrection of Jesus Christ stands as the best explanation of the historical evidence, and that leads us to our final step, drawing the conclusion. If the resurrection is true, what does that mean for us today? Section 8, the conclusion. So after going through everything, we come to the final question, what does all of this mean? Because at the end of the day, it's not just an academic exercise. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is not a mere historical puzzle. If true, it is the most important event in human history. So in this conclusion, I want to do three things. First, summarize the evidence. I know we've summarized it many times. We're going to do it again because it's important. Confront the implications, and then challenge you to respond. So first, summarizing the evidence. For the last time, these are the historical data points that secular scholars work with. They are not just theological claims or faith assumptions. They are historical data points. Jesus was crucified. No serious historian denies it. Roman and Jewish sources confirm it. Jesus was buried. Named individuals. Joseph of Arimathea placed him in a tomb. His tomb was found empty. The women discovered it, an unlikely fabrication in the cultural context. He appeared alive to many. Individuals, groups, friends, enemies, skeptics. Paul and James were transformed by encounters with him. The disciples were radically changed. From fear and despair to courage and proclamation, willing to suffer and die. And the Christian movement spread rapidly in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been crucified. Thousands joined within weeks. We weighed the alternative explanations, hallucinations, swoon theory, stolen body theory, wrong tomb theory, and legend theory. None explained the evidence as a whole. We saw that even skeptical scholars agree on many of these core facts. The resurrection hypothesis uniquely ties them together. So the historical case is strong. Here's the hard part, though. If the resurrection did truly happen, it changes everything. If Jesus really rose from the dead, then that means God exists. Miracles are possible. Jesus is who he claimed to be. The Son of God, the Messiah, the Savior of the world. The Bible is trustworthy. Jesus affirmed the Old Testament and authorized his apostles, whose writings form the New Testament. Salvation is real. Forgiveness of sins, reconciliation with God, and eternal life are possible, and hope can be certain because that means our lives are not meaningless and death is not the end. If the resurrection is true, then the Christian faith is not just a philosophy, it is reality. Now let's be honest, if the evidence is this strong, why do some still deny it? Not for all, but for many, it's not the historical problem, it's the personal cost. To accept the resurrection means submitting to Jesus as Lord. It means admitting that we are not in control, and it means turning from our sin and ourselves to follow him. That is hard. It costs us our pride and our control. Sometimes the barrier is not evidence alone, but the implication of what the evidence suggests. Let's consider what makes Christianity unique among world religions. No other major religion makes the bodily resurrection of its founder the hinge point of its entire truth claim. But the tomb of Jesus is empty. Christianity does not rest on teachings alone, but on a historical event. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:14, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. So if Jesus rose, Christianity is true. If he didn't, Christianity is false. It all hangs on this one point. No other worldviews rest so heavily on a single historical claim. So let me ask you directly, what do you do with all this? If you're a skeptic, I hope you've seen the evidence deserves serious consideration. This is not blind faith, it's reasoned belief grounded in history. If you're a believer, I hope this strengthens your confidence. Your faith is not in vain. The same Jesus who conquered death is alive today. But for all of us, the resurrection does demand a response. You cannot be neutral. If Jesus rose, you cannot ignore him. If he is alive, he has authority over your life. And if he is Lord, he calls you to repent and believe. In John 11:25-26, Jesus speaks to Martha, who is grieving for her brother's death. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? And that's the question before you. Do you believe this? Belief is not simply intellectual assent. It's trust, surrender, and saying, Jesus, I believe you are who you say you are, and I give my life to you. I submit to you. The resurrection is not just ancient history, it's present reality. It means guilt can be forgiven. It means shame can be lifted. It means addictions can be broken. It means grief is not final. And it means hope is living because Christ is alive. He is our living hope. Millions around the world testify to the transformative power of the risen Jesus in their own lives, healing marriages, restoring relationships, giving courage in suffering, and ultimately peace in death. That power is available to you. The stakes are truly weighty. If Jesus did not rise, Christianity collapses. Paul himself admitted it. But if he did rise, then eternity is at stake. C.S. Lewis put it well, saying, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. That the only thing it cannot be is moderately important. You can't treat the resurrection as a curious footnote in history. It's really all or nothing. One more framework which is worth considering is the classic Lord, Liar, Lunatic, which is the argument often attributed to C.S. Lewis. Lewis argued that Jesus made claims too radical to be the words of a mere moral teacher. Either he was deceiving others, deceiving himself, or telling the truth. Modern scholarship adds a fourth option, that being legend, that Jesus never made such claims and they were later creations of the church. When we take the resurrection seriously, legend becomes difficult to maintain. The earliest Christian writings already present Jesus as divine, risen, and authoritative. Liar fails because Jesus' moral character and his followers' willingness to die for him do not fit deliberate deception. Lunatic fails because Jesus' teachings display extraordinary psychological stability, and ethical clarity. And so the quadrilemma narrows. The resurrection recenters the question. If Jesus truly rose, then his claims about himself are vindicated, and Lord remains the explanation with the greatest coherence. So this is my challenge. If Jesus rose from the dead, then he is alive right now. He is Lord, and he is calling you to follow him. This is not just history. It's a question of eternity. And if you aren't there, I ask that you stay with me for this final section. Section 9, a final appeal to the head and heart. If you stayed with me this far, thank you so much for watching. We've walked through quite a bit of history, philosophy, and a lot of arguments, and if you still aren't convinced, I respect that completely. No one should ever pretend to believe what they don't. Please do not do that. I'd like to leave you with one more kind of argument, which is not another source or footnote, but an existential invitation. First, I hope you'll grant at least this. It is intellectually reasonable to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. You may not accept it, but I hope that you see Christian faith is not a blind leap into the dark. It is a step taken into the light of substantial evidence. Second, consider the direction of the two roads in front of you. On a purely naturalistic view, many people live rich and meaningful lives. Let's acknowledge that fairly. You can love, build, create, fight for justice, raise families, and find purpose and meaning. But on that framework, that meaning is ultimately temporary and very fragile. Eventually, the universe will forget us. Good and evil don't finally answer to anyone. Death is just the end. We're done. By contrast, if Jesus rose, then meaning, goodness, beauty, and love are not temporary sparks. They are anchored in ultimate reality. Justice is not a wish. It is a promise. Suffering is not the end. Resurrection is. Forgiveness is not simply foolishness. It's alignment with the grain of the universe as God has revealed it. So I mentioned Pascal's wager in section 1 and said we'd revisit it after going through the evidence because once again, Pascal's wager in a vacuum has no purpose and would be the equivalent of me asking you to bet your life on any unexamined claim. I'm not doing that. Using Pascal's wager in light of substantial evidence, even if it's not 100% proof, makes it at least reasonable and worth taking seriously. If Christ is risen and you trust him, you gain truth, reconciliation with God, a foundation for moral hope, and the promise that death does not get the last word. If Christ is risen and you refuse him, that refusal has eternal consequences. If Christ is not risen and you live as a Christian, you will still have pursued a life shaped by love of God and neighbor, forgiveness, humility, service, and hope. Virtues that consistently correlate with human flourishing, even by secular standards that arguably Christianity itself helped shape. If Christ is not risen and you live as if nothing ultimate is at stake, you may find short-term freedom, but no final horizon to secure meaning. This is not a call to self-deception. I'm not asking you to talk yourself into belief. I'm inviting you to seek honestly and to try obediently. Jesus didn't say, think your way into the kingdom, but he said, follow me. Sometimes clarity comes after obedience. Here is a concrete example you can try. There's no pressure and no pretense. First, read one gospel slowly, Mark or John, 15 minutes a day. Pray a simple seeker's prayer. God, if you are there and if Jesus is risen, I'm open. Please make it clear and give me courage to follow what's true. Practice 2 teachings of Jesus for 30 days. Serious real-world attempts such as forgiving someone who has wronged you or giving sacrificially to someone who cannot repay you. Then talk with a thoughtful Christian you trust. Ask your hardest questions without fear of cliches, and understand that most Christians do not have a scholarly defense prepared for their faith, but ask them what they believe and listen to what they've lived. Consider a local church for a month, not for perfection, but for a people shaped by a living hope. If you're not there, I still love you, and I'm extremely grateful you've listened genuinely. I don't respect you less for your doubts. I respect you more for taking the truth seriously. I can't promise to have every answer, but I can promise that the questions you have are worth pursuing. Once again, this is not a call to pretend belief. It's a call to respond honestly to evidence by living in alignment with what is most plausibly true. But I do ask you to please weigh the stakes carefully, because what you do matters. Thank you for hearing me out. Please feel free to share any objections or questions about what I've presented. This presentation is far from fully comprehensive or perfect, so I genuinely welcome good discourse on these topics. My only request is that we leave bias and hatred out of the conversation, which goes equally both ways for skeptics and Christians alike. We don't gain anything by shouting at one another. We can only gain by seeking truth together with love. So the evidence is strong, the case is compelling. What you do with it matters more than anything else in your life. As Paul said in Romans 10:9, if you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So once again, the question I leave you with is the same one Jesus asked Martha. Do you believe this?